David and Lisa had always dreamed of owning a home. When they found the old house on the outskirts of town, they thought it was perfect. It was spacious, affordable, and had a large basement, ideal for storage. They ignored the uneasy feeling that crept over them the first time they stepped inside. The first few days were normal, busy with unpacking and settling in. But the basement, something about it felt wrong. Lisa refused to go down there alone. She couldn't explain why, but the air was thick, heavy, as if something unseen was watching. One evening, while organizing boxes, David heard it, a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was Lisa calling from upstairs. "Lisa," he called out. No answer. The whisper came again, soft, almost pleading. David hesitated, his skin crawling. He stepped toward the farthest corner of the basement, where the sound seemed to be coming from. There was nothing there, just a cold stone wall. He shook his head, laughing nervously at himself. "Must be my imagination," he muttered. But that night, Lisa woke up with a jolt. A voice, soft, urgent, was whispering right beside her ear. Her breath hitched as she turned. No one was there. She shook David awake. "Did you hear that?" David groggily sat up. "Hear what?" "The whispering," she said, her voice trembling. David frowned, listening. Nothing but silence. "It's just the wind," he mumbled, pulling her close. Lisa wasn't convinced. The next day, she refused to go into the basement. She felt something down there, something she couldn't see but knew was watching. Days turned into weeks. The whispers became more frequent. Sometimes they were soft and distant. Other times they were right behind them. Then one night, David decided to confront whatever was causing it. Armed with a flashlight, he made his way down. The basement was freezing, colder than usual. "Who's there?" he called out. The whispering stopped. David's heart pounded. He shone his flashlight around. Nothing but shadows. But as he turned to go back up, he heard it. "Help me." His blood turned to ice. The whisper was clear this time. A voice, trembling, desperate. It was coming from the wall. Lisa heard David screaming and ran downstairs. She found him frozen in place, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "David, what's wrong?" His face was pale, his mouth slightly open. He lifted a trembling hand, pointing at the wall. Lisa turned. The bricks were shifting. No breathing. Before she could react, a violent gust of air blew through the basement. The whispering erupted into frantic, overlapping voices, each one crying out, begging for help. The walls moaned. The foundation shuddered. David grabbed Lisa's arm and bolted upstairs, slamming the basement door behind them. Neither of them slept that night. By morning, they made a decision. They needed to know what was behind that wall. They hired a contractor, a man named Bill, who laughed when they told him about the voices. "A house settling," he said, "happens all the time." But as he began removing the bricks, his expression changed. He reached a section where the mortar was different, newer. And then behind the last brick, he found it. A hollow space, a room behind the basement. Bill shined his flashlight inside, but what he saw made him stagger back. A small skeleton, curled in the corner, its hands still reaching toward the wall. Lisa gasped, covering her mouth. David stepped closer, horror gripping his chest. The remains belonged to a child. The whispering started again, louder this time. "Help me, please. Help me." Tears streamed down Lisa's face. Oh my God, they buried him alive. The police investigation confirmed it. A boy, missing for decades, sealed inside the basement. No records of who he was or how he ended up there. After the remains were removed and given a proper burial, the whispers stopped. The house was silent. David and Lisa moved out soon after. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind blows just right, neighbors swear they can still hear the faint whisper of a child. "Help me." When Emma's grandmother passed away, she left behind a house filled with memories and one peculiar doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked in places, its glass eyes strangely lifelike. Her grandmother had always kept it in a glass case, saying it was special. Emma never liked dolls. Something about their empty, staring eyes made her uneasy. But out of respect for her grandmother, she placed the doll on a shelf in her bedroom. That was her first mistake. The first few nights were quiet. Then small things started happening. The doll seemed different. At first, it was subtle. Emma would find it facing a slightly different direction, its head tilted as if it had been watching her sleep. She blamed it on her imagination. But then, one morning, she woke up to find the doll on the floor, sitting upright, facing her bed. She frowned, shivering. Maybe it had fallen. Maybe she had knocked it over in her sleep. She placed it back on the shelf. That night, she woke to a soft, scratching sound. Her breath caught in her throat. It was coming from inside her room. She turned on the lamp, scanning the room. Nothing. Everything was as it should be, except the doll. It was no longer on the shelf. It was on her dresser, sitting perfectly still. A chill ran down her spine. She was sure she hadn't moved it. Swallowing her fear, she grabbed the doll and shoved it into her closet, slamming the door shut. That night, she barely slept. But when morning came, she let out a breath of relief. It was just a doll. It couldn't really move, or so she thought. The next night, as she lay in bed, her heart pounded at the sound of something creaking. The closet door was slowly opening. Her breath hitched, and there, sitting in the doorway, was the doll. It hadn't fallen. It wasn't lying on its side. It was sitting upright, staring at her with its unblinking, glassy eyes. Emma's body turned ice cold. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, it smiled. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack in its porcelain face widened. Emma leapt from the bed, grabbed the doll, and ran downstairs. Without hesitation, she threw it into the trash bin outside, slamming the lid shut. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind sent her heart racing. But morning came, and she convinced herself it was over. The doll was gone. But when she stepped outside to take out the trash, the bin was empty. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She hurried back inside, slamming the door. Her mind raced. Maybe someone took it. Maybe. A soft thud echoed upstairs. She turned, her stomach knotting with fear. Slowly, she climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When she reached her bedroom, she stopped. The closet door was wide open, and there, sitting on her bed, was the doll. Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, dialing her best friend, Sarah. "Emma, it's late. What's wrong?" "The doll," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It keeps coming back." Sarah sighed. "You're just freaked out. It's probably nothing." Emma's eyes stayed locked on the doll. "No," she whispered. "It's something." Silence. Then Sarah asked, "Did your grandma ever tell you about it?" Emma hesitated. Her grandmother had told her something. Something strange. "Never take it out of the case, Emma. It's not a toy. It's a promise." "A promise to what?" Emma felt the air grow heavy, the room colder. Then, the doll tilted its head. Her breath hitched. She grabbed it and ran downstairs, fumbling with the fireplace matches. Her hands trembled as she lit the fire, tossing the doll into the flames. The porcelain cracked, the glass eyes blackened. But as the flames swallowed it whole, a faint voice whispered, "You broke the promise." The air grew unbearably thick, a force pushing against her chest. Then silence. The house felt different, lighter. Emma let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was over. It had to be. The next morning, she cleaned the fireplace, brushing away the last remnants of the doll. But that night, as she lay in bed, something felt off. She rolled over, and her heart stopped. Sitting on the shelf, untouched, unharmed, was a doll, and this time, it was watching her. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to rot at the edge of town. No one dared to go near it. Some said it was cursed, that the walls held secrets too dark to speak of. But James didn't believe in ghosts. When he bought the property, he saw it as nothing more than a good investment, a house he could renovate and sell for a profit. He ignored the stories, the warnings. That was his first mistake. The first few days were uneventful. Dust, cobwebs, and peeling wallpaper. Nothing unusual. He worked late into the evenings, determined to fix the place up quickly. But then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint. A breeze through an open window, maybe. But as the days passed, they grew louder. At night, he heard them in the walls, just beyond his reach. Muffled voices, pleading. He told himself it was the house settling, the wind playing tricks on him. Then the shadows moved. It wasn't just the flicker of candlelight or the way the old walls creaked. No, something was watching him. One night, as he stood in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, the mirror fogged over. Slowly, letters began to appear, as if written by an unseen hand. "Get out." James staggered back, his pulse racing. He wiped the mirror clean, but the words remained. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he decided to dig into the history of the house. What he found made his blood run cold. Years ago, a family had lived there, a mother, a father, and their young daughter, Lily. One night, the father snapped. No one knew why. Some said he had gone mad. Others whispered that something inside the house had made him do it. He murdered them, all of them, and then he vanished. The bodies of his wife and child were found buried beneath the floorboards, but his remains were never discovered. James felt sick. He had been walking over their graves. That night, the whispers turned to screams. He lay in bed, paralyzed, as an icy presence filled the room. His breath fogged in the air. The walls shook, the floorboards creaked. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The bedroom door burst open, and there standing in the doorway was a man. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes hollow and black. He reeked of death, of decay. The air around him pulsed with hate. James scrambled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. Then the ghost spoke. "You took my house." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. The man stepped closer. "You don't belong here." James tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating. The ghost's cold, dead hand wrapped around his throat. Darkness swallowed him. When he woke up, he was lying on the floor, gasping for air. His throat burned, as if something had tried to crush the life out of him. He ran. He didn't stop to grab his things. He didn't care about the investment. He just knew if he stayed, he would never leave alive. The next morning, he put the house back on the market. No one bought it. No one ever would. Because late at night, if you stand close enough, you can still hear the whispers. And if you dare step inside, you won't make it out.